I'm Dave Laird.
I'm Matt Booker.
And I'm Peyton Thomas. I'm the author of the novel Both Sides Now and the world's biggest DFW and LMA enthusiast.
LMA.
Louisa May Alcott.
Louisa May Alcott.
Oh, yeah.
Just for people who are not aware of
A friend of your pod.
Yeah.
The subject of your pod.
Maybe
Yes.
who have not heard of Peyton until today. Louisa May Alcott and David Foster Wallace, unique combination.
Yes.
But
Yeah,
you
totally.
do have a sort of viral Twitter thread about this very subject that maybe
Yes.
we can get into. But first of all, we want to say thank you for being here today. Welcome to being on Concavity Show.
Yeah, welcome to episode 70.
And
It's a thrill to be here.
Peyton
Another decade.
is joining us from Toronto. Is that right? You live
That's right, yeah.
in Canada. So
Convexity.
Yeah,
two
it's
against one.
convexity.
And Peyton's also written, I should say, like you have a full bio of places
Yeah.
where you've published in Vanity Fair, in Pitchfork, Billboard. You've written a lot about music, a lot about Louisa May Alcott, obviously, and Little
Sufjan
Women.
Stevens.
Yes.
A lot about music that Dave will know
Star
more
Wars.
about. and American Girl dolls. So
Yes,
we will
yeah.
talk. For people who
Notably.
can't see this, which is
Yes.
everyone, because we don't record a video, is that we have another guest
Yes.
who is one of your children. Do you want to introduce him?
So joining us on the call today is Helen Candenza. He's 18 inches tall. He's made of vinyl and he has a soft cloth body. I've been an American Girl doll fan since I was a kid. For those who don't know, which might be a lot of you, this is a brand that like teaches kids about history. They make dolls from different historical periods. They also have like a modern line, and they have a line where you can like customize a doll. So I went on the Customize a Doll website with Infinite Jest open next to me and like, pulled from the physical descriptions of how to make my very own Helen Candenza doll. I had a friend make a little tennis outfit for him. He has his little doll-sized tennis racket, and he's very happy to be on the show. His American, they make everything. They have a sports injury kit for dolls, and so his left ankle is taped up. Like, he is canonically compliant in
Does he
every
have a
way.
small bottle of Lemon Pledge that's proportionate to his body as well?
Not Lemon Pledge, although I have considered shelling out the $10 for the toothbrush kit, because I feel like that's
Oh, yeah. Get a NASA mug and make it a
Yeah.
complete ensemble.
no.
So this Hal doll, I have to say, is
Yeah.
maybe darker skinned than a lot of people are picturing.
Yes.
But this is actually from the text that
Yep.
the Middle Eastern attaché, I don't have the book open. I can't quote
Right.
page and verse here, but we're assuming, right, that Hal's
Yeah.
biological father is the Mid-Eastern attaché, right?
Yes. Yeah. Well,
Okay.
so that was another thing. He's often people when they fan cast him, they're like, "Oh, Michael Cera, the guy from Moonrise Kingdom. That's my Hal." In the book, Hal's skin is described as radiantly dark. He's described as being the only extant in Candenza who looks in any way ethnic. I'm quoting Wallace there. And JOI had looked ethnic, but he's no longer extant. Right. And so. And I actually you can pick skin tones in the customizer. So I was going between two, and I pulled my doll collecting group, and I was like, which one do we think which skin tone matches the description in the book? And they were like, radiantly dark, go for it. And I'm like, all right, here we go. So he is skin tone number 4, which is he's
Oh, that's great.
yeah.
Can I take a screenshot of us right
yes,
now for the
absolutely.
Instagram, and we got Hal in there? Got it.
So
Yeah.
Nice.
I met Hal and Peyton this summer at the DFW conference in Austin. And, this is one reason why I wanted to have you on the show is I had not read your book until after the conference. And, I wish that we had ordered a lot more. I wish we had officially told you, bring a lot of copies of your book, because they sold out and everyone wanted to read your book.
Yeah.
Partly based on your paper, your presentation,
Yeah.
which I want to talk about a little bit in a minute, and it was about fan fiction, but maybe I kind of wanted to start there of like,
Sure.
how did you discover Wallace? How did you hear about the conference? Like, what was sort of your path to us meeting?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm going to tell this story, and I'm sorry, it's going to make maybe a lot of listeners feel old, but I discovered Wallace when I was 11 years old.
Whoa, that's
yeah.
very young.
But consider The Lobster had just come out, so like you can put the timeline together there. And I was poking around on my dad's bookshelf looking for something to read, and Consider the Lobster was there. It had that funny little lobster waving its claw. And I'm 11, and I'm like, this looks like it's fun. It's going to be fun for me, an 11-year-old, right? So I pick up the book, and I don't know if you remember off the dome, but the very first essay in
the porn
Consider
essay.
the Lobster, yes, it's Big
Oh,
Red
Big Red
Sun.
Sun. Yeah.
It's about his.
It's vile.
It's about his trip to the Oscars
Adult
of
video
porn.
news. Yeah.
And I'm 11
Vegas,
years
yeah.
old reading this and just like, and, obviously I'm not going to put it down. I'm like, oh my God, this is like.
Yeah, that's scandalizing.
And,
do you remember the part about the actress, the starlet who has the valve under her armpits for her inflatable breast size? Yeah, that stuck with me.
I mean, that also.
That's not
stuck
actually
with me.
true, though. That was embellished.
I know that as well. And anyway, so like several details from that essay. I don't know. I know that like then the book was like the subject of some controversy in the household that I'd like gotten a hold of it. Even
It's like on the highest shelf, and you used a little stepladder to get up to it, kind of.
I don't know. I think it was a problem that I had read it at all. I think my dad was like punished for having like left it out in my that and I Am Charlotte Simmons, which like again like that's
Tom
that's
Wolfe.
like
Yeah.
and that like opens with like a pretty graphic depiction of fellatio, and I had just seen the cover
okay.
with like the fun cheerleader on.
What's that book called again? Oh, let me write that
I Am
down.
Charlotte Simmons. Yeah.
You're like, could you simulate?
Which we don't need to get into. But anyway, so I was, I had a bad habit maybe or a good habit of like raiding my dad's bookshelf and getting into stuff I wasn't allowed to read. And then when I was around, when I was around 15 or 16, he passed away, and I was sort of, I was, dweeby enough at that point that like that news made its way to me, and I got very curious. I seem to remember, although I think I may be misremembering, but I was working one Christmas as an employee at the local bookstore, and I seem to remember like The Pale King just coming out and being like big that year. So
Is this in Vancouver, the Vancouver area?
Yes, you know what? It was actually like so. I worked at the chapters on Granville Street.
Okay.
The Christmas the Christmas season of the year that he passed away. So there was a lot of David Foster Wallace on display.
Mm-hmm.
I was a teenager at the time, so they had me like manning the Twilight table. I was not. Yeah, I was not. Hawking David Foster Wallace to people. But yeah, I do remember like that was a big memorial year. I was aware of him. It really wasn't until the pandemic, though, that I took a deeper dive, because I essentially, like, I came to realize kind of very early on in 2020, I was like, I'm not going to read more in a single year. I'm not going to have more time to read in a single year than I will this year. So this is the year that I'm going to tackle all the big books that people always talk about reading, but don't, like, ever get around to. We're doing Proust, we're doing Carol Lyndon B. Johnston, we're doing War and Peace, we're doing Infinite Jest, and and of those, I think, like, I enjoyed a lot of them, but Infinite Jest far and away made the biggest and most immediate impact on me. It just reorganized my brain. Maybe as a consequence of just the way that I was reading and the amount of time I had to read, I got through it in less than a month.
Damn.
Like,
that's real fast.
No, and it was not a chore at any point. There was like kind of an initial, I was loving it, and then I got to Wardeen, and I was like,
Sure.
Which might be a common experience, but I didn't. I don't know how that made it in. I don't think it belongs there, but I found
at least it's fairly short, and it doesn't really get revisited.
I mean, I could talk about this for a while because I think it's not really defensible. Like you said, it's probably a much better book without it. But I think how it ended up in there was that he, as a grad student, wrote this thing for Arizona, and if you look at what he wrote in grad school, it was a lot of like voice exercises. Like he was doing a lot of different voices, and he was in grad school in 1985. And so 1985, like what was not just socially acceptable, but like funny or like even literary was weird shit like this. And I think he was trying to say like, oh, I had, he had been to Boston or like, he had been to New York and like, he grew up in Illinois. He was not like some urban guy. It was like, oh, I'm going to tell the Black experience, But the original title of it was Las Meninas, which is this famous painting, Vasquez painting, and it's sort of like the little people, and the whole thing is just a problematic mess. But like, it's definitely like not aged, is even at all. Like it's aged even worse. And we have tried to contextualize it as much as we can, but that is there's where some people younger than me put it down.
No, like, so I say that only because, like, it was the one hiccup. It was the one place where I was like, oh, God, I don't know. I will say also, I mean, this is heady stuff we're getting into right off the top, but I like, my other kind of familiarity with Wallace had been, I knew about Jamie Loftus's project where she ate infinite jest. Right?
Yeah. How did she ever do on that? I don't know. I never saw, like, a resolution to that story. Did you?
I think the YouTube video where she, where she collects all the clips was sort of the culmination. But I was aware of Infinite Jest, like, reputation. I was aware that it had that reputation in part because Mary Karr had spoken publicly about her experiences with Wallace and the ways in which he'd been physically and emotionally abusive to her. So I knew that I wanted to tackle Infinite Jest. But I had to do some reading just on her, on Mary Karr's allegations and her experiences in their relationship, and kind of the thing that made me think, okay, it's all right to read this book was one that Mary Karr herself in the Twitter thread where she spoke about this said, like, I don't want people to not read Infinite Jest, right? And in her book The Art of Memoir, which I subsequently read, she talks about like her favorite parts of Infinite Jest. So she wasn't airing these things to put a ban on Infinite Jest or anything, but it just felt important to acknowledge that. And also, sorry, when I say like the thing that made me think, okay, this is all right to read and participate in, was that she spoke about receiving a handwritten letter of apology from him for like the specific things that he'd done. And that struck me as like, okay, like this is someone who has made amends and worked through this issue with her, which is quite a different situation from some certain, famous men who deny all wrongdoing, refuse to, like, ever make amends for anything they've done. And I thought, okay, like, this is someone I can, like, in good conscience engage with. I will say that, like, along with getting really into Wallace, which I am, I feel that, like, it behooves me to also, like, read everything Mary Karr has ever written, which I have, and Adrian Miller's memoir, In the Land of Men, which is also about her experience of her relationship with Wallace. I've read all that. Like, I think it's important to, if you're going to be a fan, to also, like, be very, very aware of, the women in his life. And
read Karen Green's book, Bow Down. Adrian Miller book, which I definitely have some problems with, because I think some of the stuff she brought up in there is really not like what. Anyway, I don't want to get into it too much, but I do appreciate what you're saying about that with Mary Karr. I do believe that he had made amends and apologized to her, and she had accepted it. She writes about this in Lit, and that does matter to me. Like you're saying, if you're someone who is unrepentant fucking asshole to the day they die, and just say blame someone else, that's a little bit of a different case. Like every case is different, but it does matter to me. As someone who has maybe not lived a perfect life either and done things that I regret, it does matter to me if someone apologizes to me or if I apologize to them and try to make amends. So there's definitely like shades of gray to every interaction, but like
Yeah.
few people posthumously have had their lives and relationships, you know, written books about so soon after their death. It is a very
so what
interesting
you're saying, Matt,
case.
is like he used to be a piece of shit. People can change.
Yeah, it's not
People
even
can change. You know?
Fucking
Yeah.
Dave, man.
it's not even like he used to be bad, but then he stopped. It's like he recognized that he harmed Mary Carr and wrote a letter of apology to her, which I think many, you know, survivors of abuse don't get, right? And
Sure, yeah.
and it's kind of what everyone wishes for. So when I
There's
learned
probably
that
a
he'd done
long
that,
letter to it,
yeah,
I imagine, as well.
yeah,
Highly articulated and encyclopedic in nature.
Yes. So once I learned about that, I was like, okay, I can go ahead and order Infinite Jest. I read it. I was like, my life is different now. and at the time I was actually editing Both Sides Now, and I submitted a draft like after reading Infinite Jest, and my editor was like, what did you read that has made like this draft so weird? And I had to roll it back in a big way. But
Oh yeah.
as you mentioned, one of the things that made it from that kind of post Infinite Jest draft was there's a moment where, so the book Both Sides Now, it's a young adult novel about a trans boy who is a high school debater. He's very competitive. They make it all the way to the national debate tournament, only to learn that the topic that he has to debate is trans rights. So if he wants to win,
and bathrooms.
If he wants to win, he's going to have to debate against, you know,
His own humanity.
his own rights, right? So he's figuring out what to do about that, and in one round, like, and he's also negotiating a crush on his debate partner, who is that's a whole nother thing. So anyway, a pivotal moment at the national debate tournament winds up being they run into a couple of debaters from a tennis academy just outside Boston, and afterward, after they mop the floor with these debaters from Boston, but then afterward he sees the boys like consoling one another and kissing, and it's like it makes him aware of everything he's suppressing with his own debate partner and his crush.
Right. Quote, who hail weirdly from a tennis academy.
Yes.
Yeah, it's really weird that that sly Infinite Jest reference made it into your book, for sure, Peyton.
It's pretty funny. And I mean, it's like, they get to speak. Like, my Boston Tennis Academy debaters, like, get to speak. Their names are James and Matthew.
James and Matthew, right?
Which,
so, like,
that's
Maddie Pemulis?
Yeah, it's Hal and Pemulis's middle names. So it was like a very wink, wink,
nice.
nudge, that like nobody will pick up on unless you're like very.
You never know.
Well, I forgot those names with their middle names, but I thought like James N. Candenza and Maddie Pemulis.
Yeah.
So like, you know, but
So
that because your sort of fan fiction like vibe is that you want Pemulus and Hal to be together, right?
I mean,
romantically,
I'm saying it's Halulus Nation. I'm saying the snow was virgin white, yachting cap white. I'm saying there was scattered homosexuality at Enfield Tennis Academy, much of it emotional and unconsummated. I'm just these are just
some of the theories, some ideas rattling around. Awesome.
Some of the moments,
And the book Infinite Jest itself makes its way into this novel as well as serving as a stack along with War and Peace, right?
Yeah, it's a makeshift podium.
On them.
Yeah,
That's
so
right,
so you can very much pick up on like the love that I have for the book.
Totally,
Yeah, it wound up being, I mean, a real like consolation to me as I was just going through some stuff in my personal life and trying to like get this book out the door, right? So I'm very glad to have found it. And then, so that was kind of mid 2020, and then I again had nothing but free time on my hands to read, so picked up, you know, Wallace's entire bibliography and just read, and here I am.
So and then you find yourself at a Wallace conference last year.
So this year,
that's how it happens.
2022.
Oh yeah, this year.
And
it's been a long year.
Your paper there was on fan fiction and AO3, which a lot of people maybe don't know. Archive of Our Own, probably the main repository of fan fiction. And, you know, a few things that I learned there are just about the history of fan fiction. Like, I think a lot of people know the name, they've heard of it, but they don't actually know what the fuck it is. And one of the main things I learned from it is just who the audience is and who the producers are, which is like 80% women, and mostly like lesbians. And a lot of this makes sense. Like once you go through the history of it, where this comes from is that, okay, we understand shipping, like going back to Star Trek era, where people are like, okay, like just like you were saying in Infinite Jest, there's some weird sexual tension going on. What if, and next thing you know, people can share this on the internet. And, there's this big explosion. But do you want to just give us a little bit of a rough overview of that, like the point, the history of it that you were making there?
Sure. So I wanted to look at Infinite Jest both as a work of fan fiction in and of itself, but which is something that has been widely acknowledged, but not people will say, oh, it's an adaptation of Hamlet. It includes certain elements of the Brothers Karamazov. They can point, or it owes a lot to Ulysses, right? Like there have been entire scholarly papers written on that, but there's not so much of a understanding of Infinite Jest as fan fiction of those works, right? And so in my presentation, I gave a history of fan fiction, including like at the point of the composition of Infinite Jest, which was in the 90s when it was just coming online, but it was still largely like people were writing zines. Like publishers of zines were getting, copyright cease and desist notices. But it was at that point in the 90s when Infinite Jest was being written, fan fiction was a response to broadcast television, which Infinite Jest also largely is, right? Like that, we know that broadcast television was something that Wallace wrote about and cared about very deeply. We know that there's a lot of discourse on like television and the future of media in Infinite Jest. And there's also, interestingly, there are nods to, like, the culture of broadcast television fan fiction of the 90s in Infinite Jest. Like, there's a character who becomes obsessed with MASH, Steeply's father, right?
Yeah.
And has, and develops this, intense fixation on one character from MASH and just writes reams and reams of fan fiction about this one character, writes letters to the actor in the studio, and it just becomes an obsessive thing. And I actually have some friends who are members of the MASH fandom and write MASH fan fiction in 2022.
Okay.
And I posted just those pages of Infinite Jest on my blog for them to read, and they were all sharing it and was like, "This is us!" Finally.
That's amazing.
So
this is us from almost 20 years ago.
Yeah. So I found a lot in Infinite Jest that seemed relevant to a discussion of fan fiction as it was being produced at that time. And then I also wanted to ask, the purpose of fan fiction largely is to explore, secondary characters, who maybe don't get the status of protagonists, or it's to explore relationships or hidden scenes, things that were left out of the narrative. And all of those are major features of Infinite Jest, which would seem to suggest that, there are so many opportunities for exploration through fan fiction, and yet there is a real dearth of any kind of Infinite Jest fan fiction. So in my presentation, I wanted to both look at Infinite Jest as a work of fan fiction and why there isn't really very much Infinite Jest fan fiction. Like I mentioned, I said on Archive of Our Own, which is the premier fan fiction repository, there are 5 in Infinite Jest fan fiction, so we have time to look at all of them.
We did.
Tell me about those. I didn't get to hear you talk, so I'm into those. Yeah,
so there are literally 5, and interestingly enough, there's also a culture of fan fiction as being something you do for a friend. Fan fiction is very relational. It's a way of connecting with other people. So the first 3 fics on that's kind of you say fics instead of fan fictions. The first 3 fics on AO3 in the Infinite Jest category were gifts for other people. In specific people host events where you say oh, I want someone to write me an Infinite Jest fan fiction, and then you'll be paired with someone who will write that for you, and it's like a Christmas gift exchange. Anyway.
Oh, cool. So, it's like a mixtape club. But,
yeah. So cool. The first 3, there's one that's Hal heals himself from his aphasia by writing fan fiction, which is a fun concept.
That's meta. Yeah.
Yeah. There's one that's a missing scene between Johnny Gentle and the Premier of Canada, the Prime Minister of Canada, which is that one's actually really funny.
Wow.
And then there's a third one, which is like 10,000 words long, and like very carefully trying to hew to like Wallace's voice, which is actually a crossover between Infinite Jest and a webcomic called Homestuck, which I don't know if anyone's familiar with. I didn't get any like nods, but so
from the crowd.
Yeah, Homestuck is deeply influenced by Wallace generally and Infinite Jest specifically, like, and the link that this person found was like, okay, I'm going to weave Infinite Jest into the narrative of the characters from Homestuck, who are French-Canadian alcoholics.
Okay.
So there was like a very natural blend that this person found and really ran away with and had a great time with, which was very fun. And so those were the kind of first three. And then there's one that is just like porn about Avril, which the less said about that one, the better. And then a recent one, which was like a romance between Kate Gomford and Joelle Van Dyne. Which I actually, this is funny. I was just on Instagram chatting with, another, like a fellow Wallace fan who's like a 19-year-old college student who like found me because I post about Wallace and Infinite Jest sometimes. And I was saying, I did a presentation at the Wallace Festival about fan fiction. She's like, oh, I actually wrote some. It was like a love story between Kate Gomford and Joelle Van Dyne. I'm like, great, then I'll present it on your
Oh, that's amazing.
That's awesome.
So I now know the author of that work. And she was like...
That's so good.
She was a little mortified, but she's very excited to come to the festival next year. So, yeah.
Sweet. And then in the presentation, you had us also try to write some of our own.
I heard about that. Yeah, that's so cool.
I said everyone gets 10 minutes, just like we're going to try to write Drabble, which is like a fan fiction of exactly 100 words. And I just let people go crazy, and it was a lot of fun. Yeah.
Did people read what they'd written? Some of them.
We shared it with our partners.
We did. Oh yeah. It was. We shared it with our partners.
What'd you write about, Matt?
So I remember I wrote about like if Hal and Oren had kids. Ooh. and what their kids like later on did, and in my fan fiction their two sons are their only surviving members of the Inkendenza family, and they moved to Hawaii and become professional wrestlers. And this was based on like the true like wrestling family that I know from Texas, where the only surviving like kids did move to Hawaii. So that was like not that creative, but like it allowed me to at least get into that like creative space of like just thinking about all the different relationships in the book and like what would you really want to see. And like I found it like, and Peyton, I don't know if you know this, but like that kind of creative shit doesn't happen very often at academic conferences.
Yeah.
So it's really rare that we get the opportunity to do something like fun.
No, it wound up being that was also, I got to share the morning with Danielle Ely, and we did like The Price is Right with
the game show, right?
with like the like depend adult undergarments and stuff. And so it wound up being a fun morning. And I think I don't think creative writing exercises happen all that much at academic conferences, which by like the DFW conference was the first academic conference I had ever been to. So
most of them are not this fun, I'm telling you.
I understand that. But I also I found that like part of the reason I wanted to present on this was that I'd come into kind of Wallace fan groups and found that I was used to like a very participatory creative culture of fandom, and I found that Wallace fandom was often about like cold analysis and trying to decode the writing and like what does this mean, what is the correct answer, which was so just antithetical to everything that I'd ever learned in my experiences in fan communities. So I wanted to kind of open it up to this other way of doing fan experiences, which is like actually you can, rather than trying to figure out what happened in the narrative gaps in Infinite Jest, like just write it, just decide for yourself what goes there, right? So that was my like me getting on my soapbox at the DFW conference. It was a lot of fun.
And awesome. I really liked that what you say, because I have been to a lot of DFW conferences, and like in the early stages of them. We did try to include like some creative writing tracks, like people who had written, because obviously like the book does attract creative people, and it's like, let's have an outlet for them. And like one thing at this year's conference we did was try to have some creative writers who are not there to do like an academic paper, but you know, people like Dario Diofebi and Debel and Unferth, and that they're there to speak as writers per se. But we also every year sort of get people who are just like doing Wallace for like a year, you know, and they're just like, and it's really bizarre because like I'm there regardless if I'm presenting anything, but to have people that just sort of, you know, fly in and be like, you know, next year they're going to go to some other, you know, single author society next year, and we only see them once. It's sort of, it's nice to see people year after year too, who like Danielle, you mentioned, who's been to every single one. It's like our summer camp. So I'm glad you picked up on all of that. I'm glad that you were able to enjoy it. It was really awesome. I want to backtrack even a little bit farther because you mentioned basically take this. I really liked what you said about taking your dad's books off the shelves, because I was thinking that's how I became a reader. I feel like that, you know, I loved your book, and I don't read a ton of like YA, right? And the ones that I do, I gotta say I really liked, because I have teenagers. My oldest son is 15. My youngest is 12. So I have kids in the house, and like I read their books with them. We buy books together. We've read a lot of the popular YA books, and I have other friends who are write YA stuff. But I was thinking, like, you know, I was born in the 70s, and it was like not a great time for YA. There was still like, you know, read the Ramona Quimby books and read like Roald Dahl. Yeah, like I was big into Trixie Belden. Like, I don't know if you know Trixie Belden book, but it was like really not until later that, you know, the sort of explosion of YA. So I guess my question is like partly about you as a writer. Like, what was your path to becoming from that like child stealing books off of your dad's shelves to becoming like saying, I want to do this? Yeah.
So I had always wanted to be an author. I mean, when I say always, like I was 7 years old when I kind of inherited an old desktop computer from an older brother and used it to write my first book, which was called Chocolate Island, which was about a group of kids who are marooned on an island made of chocolate. And I still think that idea has legs. Like, I might do something with that, right? But there was
I want more.
There was always this ambition to be a writer, an author. It was always what I was good at. I had an easy time in English. I loved to read. And in college, I studied political science. And after college, I worked in public policy while sort of writing on the side as not quite a hobby, but sort of like with the understanding that I was not going to be able to make money as a writer. Like, I would need to have a day job. And weirdly, it wasn't until I quit a bad public policy job in 2017 and was sort of applying to other jobs and had a lot of free time to kind of finish up my manuscript that I started taking it seriously. I signed with an agent, and was soon enough was just like writing for a living. Like, I think quitting that job, while the intention when I quit was to very much still stay in the public policy sphere, it wound up just being the opportunity I needed to take writing seriously and start writing for a living. Initially just through freelance journalism and actually video game writing, which is a little known but incredibly lucrative contract gig for writers. But so as for writing young adult, that just came out of being, you know, having grown up as a queer teenager with very limited opportunities to read queer narratives, and having to go to fan fiction, in fact, for a lot of quote unquote representation. Of like queer life and love stories. And the first agent I signed with had agented a very successful queer YA book that was later made into a movie. So I knew that I wanted him to represent me, and I was very lucky that he signed on with me.
What was that book called?
Simon versus the Homo sapiens Agenda, which was made into Love, Simon. But that book wound up, because it was so successful, it wound up really opening the door for queer YA as maybe more than like a niche market. And there was a real boom in queer YA. I say was because like I think we're now entering a regressive period, unfortunately, where a lot of those books are being banned and publishers are less like eager to publish books that are going to be banned in like key markets. So I'm just speaking very, but that was a time when a lot a lot of like kind of really groundbreaking stuff was being published in YA. YA was at that moment, it was coming away from like the dystopia boom.
That was such a boom. Hey.
Which I will say, I think The Hunger Games, the first book, is excellent. I think it is a superb young adult novel. I think very little of what it inspired is any good, which is often the case. And I just think Twilight and all of the knockoffs are a wash. That's anyway. But so we were sort of coming out of this like big YA franchise era into a time when like contemporary YA, just about teenagers and their lives and relationships without a lot of embellishment, was the moment. Like another book that my first agent had sold was The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas, which is a hugely influential YA novel about a young black girl who is the sole witness when her friend is shot by a police officer. And that's also an excellent book, but it just like it shows the shift where like suddenly, the big sellers, the like number one on the bestsellers list for hundreds and hundreds of weeks, are just like a black girl trying to negotiate life with police violence, or like a queer boy falling in love, and like that's the market. So Both Sides Now was very like, it was just a very grounded story about a trans boy doing high school debate, and I think it fit very well into that moment. And it was something that I wanted, that I wish I'd been able to give to myself as a younger person, and I was very grateful to have the opportunity to write it. Yeah.
There's that in your thanks. You say that you like were writing towards your partner this book or something like that.
Yeah.
But before you'd met him, so it's like, and in a weird way, it's almost like you were writing this book backwards in time to yourself, to your younger self in a way.
Yeah, like I say like to my younger, like, and I'm very like, honestly, I was, even as like a person in their mid-20s, like I was, I'd be in my therapist's office like, I can't be a trans man. Like, that is not something that I can be. I definitely can't be a trans man and like date other men. Like, are you out of your mind? And so I was honestly just writing Both Sides Now, and like the love story between Finch and his debate partner Jonah, to like convince myself that it was possible, right?
This is an act of therapy and like self-realization.
Yeah, and I'm now, cool. I now just, like I'm in a much healthier place with regard to my relationships. Actually, the account on Instagram that you found me on, Dave, was co-run with me and my partner at the time. Like we. Oh, okay. Yeah. Which was actually he picked up Infinite Jest to impress me, which says a lot. That was a big gesture.
Sure.
So, yeah, it was very much about like writing toward believing something is possible, and it's really unfortunate that like in just the past year or so, like Moms for Liberty and like state governments have come down so hard on trans youth, like.
So this is going on in my neighborhood right now, and we just had a big election, last week, where we defeated all 5 of the candidates who were running for school board on a Moms for Liberty campaign. But I look up the road in Keller, Texas, where they have a really nasty school board, and they just adopted a books policy that basically bans any mention of gender fluidity, of trans existence. And this is something that's happening like in the year 2022 in our neighborhood, like in people I know are affected by this. And I'm on the board of trustees of our library. So I luckily we answer to no one. We are a public library, and so we can do whatever we want at that library. But I am very worried about the schools. Is that it seems like there's some places where those kids are really under attack.
And we're seeing that in Canada too. Hey, Peyton, with like anti-Soji groups.
I mean, fortunately, it's less. I think it will be less successful in Canada, right? I think the structures of American democracy, if I can just push my glasses on my nose a little bit, like,
literally.
There was a New Yorker article like last week about Moms for Liberty, which didn't quite do all the excavation, but certainly pointed to it being like an astroturfed group by the Republican Party, just trying to exert real control over like school boards and not just spread panic about trans children and gender identity, but especially there's sort of a parallel panic with regard to quote-unquote critical race theory, which they seem to literally define as like any book with a person of color in it.
Yep.
And like this Moms for Liberty movement is like a very direct reaction to this, like it's retaliation to, you know, like the work of Angie Thomas becoming like widely assigned in schools, to, you know, YA adaptations of queer love stories being made, right? And we are, you know, like we're past the point of just like, oh no, I hope this doesn't happen. Like people are already not getting book deals. Like if you look at like the YA bestsellers list today, like there are fewer queer titles, fewer titles by and for people of color. Unfortunately we're kind of entering a regressive moment in the culture, which is really a shame. But
you mentioned your first agent, and you know, I kind of picked this up from the acknowledgments that you've changed agents because your current agent is
Bonnie Nadell.
Yes.
David Foster Wallace.
Walk us
David
through
Foster
how that
Wallace is a
happens.
longtime agent, and Wallace is like one of his best friends in life. And that's got to be.
We talked a lot about trying to get her on the show like years ago, didn't we, Matt?
And I mean, I have corresponded with her. Like she knows we exist, and like she knows this podcast exists. But tell us like how that happened.
So in very early 2021, my agent at the time left publishing. It was very sudden. I was suddenly without an agent in my debut year.
That's
and
not great timing.
And so I was luckily in a position where he had left the publishing industry under controversial circumstances very publicly. So I actually I had agents coming to me and asking to represent me, which was a very privileged position to be in, right? I know that like me and some of the other orphans from that incident were like being circled like a hawk. Right. But I was already in a place where I was I write YA, but I also, like, as you mentioned, I write music criticism. I do long form journalism. I'm interested in writing for adults. Like I wear different hats, which is not actually so common with YA writers, mostly because like YA writers are prolific. Like this, like if you're a YA writer, you're probably putting out a book every year. Which doesn't leave a lot of room for extracurricular activity like mine, like writing for Pitchfork or whatever. So I wanted someone who could maybe represent me in different areas, and like it was a total moonshot, but you know, I was just riding the high of having, you know, not discovered Wallace, but read Infinite Jest for the first time in the pandemic year, and you know, being just really, you know, having that shape my life in a big way. And I wound up writing to Bonnie Nadell and sending her a voicemail and just saying, hey, my agent just left publishing and I have this book coming out and would love to chat. And she called me back and we talked.
Wow, cool.
And I sent her the manuscript right away. And you know, I was like, no expectations. She doesn't represent YA. Like that is just not her department at all. with a couple of exceptions, which is mostly just like she's had a book do well in the adult market, and a YA publisher said like, hey, could we do like a young reader's version of this, which happens sometimes. Or actually, in one interesting case, she had a client who was Turkish write a couple of very successful novels about like life in Turkey, and then American Girl reaches out and is like, hey, we're doing this line of dolls that are like from different countries, and does she want to write like the YA novel about like the girl from Turkey? So Bonnie did actually, she has brokered one American Girl doll book, which does make me wonder how close were we to a DFW American Girl book. Probably not very, but
I'm sure you could write it for us, baby. You're the guy to do it.
Yeah, so I wrote to Bonnie, and I sent her the manuscript. I'm like, okay, you know what? She's not a YA agent. Maybe nothing will come of this, but at least I shot my shot. And I didn't even remember until after I'd sent it that the most recent draft was the one that included like the tennis players from Boston. I was like, oh no! No, but she wound up being very charmed by the book, and she and I have had an incredibly fruitful working relationship ever since. She is just lovely. She is much better at getting back to me than the last agent was. Let's say that.
That's worth a lot.
Yeah, and she, like, I can say, like, not all agents do this, but she will really take on, like, an editorial role and, like, let me know when something isn't working, like, help me shape things at the proposal stage as well. Like, it's a total joy to work with her. I feel very lucky.
Oh. Yeah. Have you brought up Wallace at all with her? Have you mentioned Wallace to her?
Not a lot. Like, I say that because, like, maybe it will come up eventually, but, like, you know, like, this was someone who was, like, a very close friend of hers, and I just, you know, I don't want to
cross
cry.
That line.
Exactly, yeah. I will say, like, one thing that happened where I sort of did discuss with her was I spoke at the LA Times Festival of Books earlier this year and noticed that Michael Shore was also on the program. And I knew that Michael Shore I believed at the time that he still held the film rights to Infinite Jest. And actually, last fall, I did a research trip to Harvard to go through the Louisa May Alcott archives in preparation for another book that I'm writing. And I took a day at another library to read Michael Shore's, like, Infinite Jest thesis that he'd written as an undergraduate, which was it was incredible. Like, Infinite Jest had come out, like, that spring, so we'd pretty much read it and been like, I'm writing my thesis on this.
Yeah.
And it was just very, like, I'm 21 years old and buzzing about this incredible thing I just discovered, so it was just lovely.
Yeah. And then he was, like, the head of the Lampoon for a while, right? And he invited Wallace to come to, like, their dinner, which he did, and they smoked cigarettes together. Yeah. And there's a picture of them. He talked about it on a podcast that was, like, 3 hours long.
So when I found out that Shore was coming to this festival, I like, took a deep breath, and I was like, Bonnie, like, do you know him? Like, is there any way you could maybe introduce me? And she sort of clued me in on, like, the long and complex history of the Infinite Jest screen rights, which we don't need to get into, but
I mean, they lapse. They lapse after, like, a year, right? Mm-hmm.
It's more complicated than that, but we don't need to get into that on the record. But anyway, I wound up introducing myself to Michael Shore at the festival, and he and I just, like, we had a lovely chat over lunch, and
awesome.
Everything is connected, and it's the smallest world, but, like, his mother is a tour guide at the Louisa May Alcott House Museum.
Oh, shit.
Okay.
So I sit down thinking, like, we're going to talk about Wallace, and we spend the whole time talking about Alcott. It was great, yeah.
I've had a couple of interactions with him on Twitter, and he did respond to some Infinite Jest stuff on Twitter.
Oh, yeah.
That's a really awesome story. And, like, you know what you're saying about, like, you know, Bonnie not wanting to talk about Wallace yet. Yeah. She still sells the Wallace rights constantly. And even though she doesn't represent the estate anymore, she still does sell the rights. But I had a similar thing with, like, Mary Carr. Like, she just doesn't want to be asked about Wallace anymore. Yeah. Like, imagine, like, you have your whole business, you have all these other writers, and, like, people want to talk to you about this one thing, or, like, you know, Mary Carr's written, like, a dozen books, and, like, people want to ask her about Wallace's books. Same things happen with friends, and and like, I kind of get it, but it's sort of like, it would be like, I compare Wallace to being like that important of a writer. It'd be like, oh, and also I knew Ernest Hemingway, and be like, people are like, oh shit, like what? Do you want to talk about that? It's like, oh, I'm sick of getting asked about Albert Einstein. It's like, what the fuck?
And honestly, like, I get that when I like, we were probably half an hour into recording this or whatever, but before Bonnie's name came up, like, I don't, like, when I do mention that Bonnie Nadell is my agent, Wallace is the first thing people ask about more often than not. Even like, I did a speaking engagement at a school in Los Angeles, and was chatting with the teacher who was like moderating, and I was like, yeah, Bonnie, like, she's represented a lot of cool authors, and she's like, I'm David Foster Wallace. And I'm like, well. But in fact, like, I'd been on the Hill Nadell website when I was thinking about reaching out to her, and like, Emily St. James is on there, like a lot, like a lot of people, like
St. John Mandel.
No. Emily St. James is the TV critic. Formerly.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, okay, yeah.
Just so we have.
She probably gets that a lot. Yeah,
she probably. But like
we'll edit that out so I don't look like an idiot.
Yeah, it's okay. So Emily St. James, Lila Sturgis, who's like a very cool like YA comic writer. So like I knew, like, there were people I knew already, like, and trans and queer people being represented. So like I knew that this was a place where like I would not be an anomaly, which was important to me. So I, like, it was honest, like, it was obviously, like, I had, like, I'm not going to sit here and say, like, Wallace wasn't a factor, but certainly not the only factor. Like, it seemed for different reasons, like, that Bonnie was actually a good fit for me. Like, she was someone who could help me publish nonfiction projects, in addition to YA. And, and so it's been lovely working with her, and it's been very exciting. Yeah, but it's not something I've talked with her at length about.
Maybe down the line.
Again, I mean, I think it's just a testament to this Wallace's stature, and that there are very few other people on her website who have like conferences devoted to them. So it's like, it would be weird if I didn't ask you about it.
Of course.
I was planning to as well. So.
And I'm happy to talk about her because she's the best, and like, it's wonderful working with her. Yeah.
That's cool. Can you, I'm really interested in your work with Pitchfork. Can you walk us through like how that started for you? And like, you've done so many reviews for them, and I looked through a bunch of them, and I was like, oh wow, I love Pine Grove and Titus Andronicus and Lucy Dacus and Pup and St. Vincent and all these other bands that you've reviewed. Like, I've been reading Pitchfork for 20 years probably, or whatever, since it's
No,
so,
and I mean, I'm likewise, curious. Like, I was a 14-year-old who like still was like, Hannah Montana makes some good points when I discovered Pitchfork and started, like.
And then you got into like Belle and Sebastian as your next step, I'm sure, right?
No,
from Hannah Montana.
And like that Pitchfork has existed back in the day was like a very, it's a different institution now. I mean.
Sure. Yeah. The
like
Condé Nast takeover and all that.
Like I found something very fun. Like, they published a new like best of the 90s list. And the best songs of the 90s did not have Neutral Milk Hotel on it.
Yeah, and that's fucked.
On the new list. Well, but it was, and people were publishing, like the picture of Lennon with like his assistant, who's then been like airbrushed out, and it's like Pitchfork leaving Neutral Milk Hotel off the list. It was like, but yeah, so it's a different institution now. And anyway, when I started writing for it, I was running a website with my friends. Like no one was making any money off this website. We were just doing it for fun. It was called The Niche, and I wrote something like 20,000 word article that was ranking every Sufjan Stevens song, and not just like
some of this.
not just making a list, but like I wrote like a paragraph for every song. It took months. Like this,
and in some cases like multi paragraph entries. Like for the Palisade song, which was your number one. That's a long entry.
Yeah, by like the top 10.
Yeah. Sorry. I gotta say, I really agree with your pick for his worst song, which is "Super Sexy Woman," which I agree is total trash.
Yeah.
And like, I loved your entry for "Come Thou Fount."
Yeah.
Which is like, an 18th century hymn or whatever, and you're like, I have a complicated relationship with Christianity, but this song captures something really wonderful about maybe that tradition of like, there's grappling and there's running away, and
which
I love that list. That's great.
Which is a really wonderful thing about Sufjan Stevens, is just like his approach to faith. Anyway, so that article was shared by the reviews editor at Pitchfork, Jeremy D. Larson, and by the music editor at Billboard, and they followed me on Twitter, and I immediately sent them a message and started writing for both publications.
Okay, that article did it.
So it was really lovely how that worked out, because I was not doing that with like any kind of expectation. It was just like, the world needs this definitive ranking.
How many hours do you think that took you to write?
Like, when I say it did take months, and actually more, because I very stupidly just did the entire thing in the WordPress backend editor. So then,
did you lose some stuff?
I did lose some stuff.
Oh,
So it took a long time, but I was I was going through like a pretty bad heartbreak that fall, and it was like the only thing I was working on, so it wound up being like a path through that.
Gotcha.
So I started writing for Pitchfork then. It's been a really fun experience. I've got to do some really cool things. The editorial, like, I've written for places where like I submit a draft and they just publish it. Like, there's no editorial interference at all, because the digital media ecosystem is hell. But like at Pitchfork, I always get edited at Pitchfork. I get edited rigorously, and I really value that. It has made me a much better writer. I've gotten to do, sometimes I pitch a review, sometimes I'm assigned, so I get to kind of step out of my comfort zone. Sometimes I get to do really fun stuff, like I got to review Peppa Pig's second album.
I saw that, yeah. What rating did you give it?
I got a 6.5.
And so technical question, do you with each individual review, do you decide on the rating number, or is there like an aggregate of other critics and you sort of sit down and you're like, what are we scoring this at?
So I can suggest a score range, and sometimes, usually that's like honored, and sometimes the editors, I had one review where I just like hated the album, and the editors were like, okay, but we love this album, so fix the review, and the score range is not going to cut it. So
this is fun. A funny thing about Pitchfork's history is like Andrew WK's I Get Wet, when it came out, got like 0.5 out of 10 or something. And then, recently they came out with a list of, what was it, best albums.
It was best new reissue.
Like, sorry, we fucked up. This is a 10 out of 10 or whatever.
It was pretty, I think the Andrew WK record, which is phenomenal, by the way, it went from 0.6 on release to like 8.6 best new reissue.
Yeah, totally.
So, and I think there's an acknowledgement of the way that, like, sometimes Pitchfork gets it wrong. Well, like, Pitchfork is also like a 25-year-old institution at this point. It's now, I think it might be the only music publication edited by a woman of color. Like, the editor-in-chief is Pooja Patel. Like, so the perspective now is very much like, you look at the 90s list, there are a lot more women on that list, there are a lot more people of color on the list. Like, it's getting into histories that were neglected before. So
totally. And lots of different genres of music too, right? Like, it used to be just indie rock basically, and now it's like hardly any indie rock and tons of like rap and R&B.
when they gave Taylor Swift an 8 out of 10, the Swifties were incensed. They were very upset. And I read one tweet that was like, hey, Pitchfork, how about you hire some indie reviewers so you can properly review this Taylor Swift indie album, which was very funny.
Sure, that's the irony's rich.
The Peppa Pig thing was very fun. Because Pitchfork used to have, like, the reviews used to be pretty mischievous. Like, sometimes a review, there's one album by Jet where the review was just an embedded video of a monkey peeing into its own mouth. Right?
Yes, I remember it fondly.
So with, like, Peppa Pig, I was like, Peppa is a 4-year-old pig. There aren't a lot of pigs in the music industry, so she's really fighting an uphill battle to be taken seriously in the pop sphere. I was completely deadpan.
Hamming it up, as it were.
Hamming it up, And what's really, the review was a lot of fun to write, but, like, just the image of, like, Peppa Pig's face next to, like, 6.5 has been, like...
I laughed at that.
Anytime any major artist gets less than a 6.5, like, Peppa's going, like, Peppa Pig is, like, next to Jack Harlow's face or Drake or whoever, and it's like, I got on CNN for inciting beef between Peppa Pig and Kanye West over the...
Like, you were a talking head on CNN?
No, it was like they put up a screenshot of my review with my byline on it. And we're like,
Amazing.
because Kanye got a 6, which is lower than a 6.5, and then the official Peppa Pig Twitter account was like, Peppa didn't need to like throw parties at Mercedes-Benz Stadium to get that extra 0.5, and so there was a feud. It's just a lot of fun.
Amazing.
I love writing for Pitchfork. I recently I panned a very kind of niche popular pop star, which you never want to do because that's where the fans are most vicious, and they were
was
not.
Was it Ariana Grande?
No, it was Tuvalu, and who actually I really like. But this record was a real disappointment for me. And anyway, so her fans were very upset, and they dubbed me the Pitchfork Twink, and I was like, very well. I mean, if I'm so yeah, it's a lot of fun. I really enjoy writing for Pitchfork. Yeah.
What's the highest score you've given?
Gosh,
to an album?
I think it's an 8.1, or an 8, which I gave to.
That's pretty tough.
Yeah, well, they're very stingy. Like they're really, really like tough about scoring at Pitchfork. There's a real they don't do grade inflation, as it were.
Sure.
And like, there's been a couple times where I've like advocated for an album to be best new music, and I just haven't won out. But I think the 8.1 was for Taylor Vick's album as Boy Scouts, which was self-titled, I believe. And Black Belt Eagle Scout, I just love Scouts, I guess, her album, At the Party with My Brown Friends, which was also really excellent. And so I recommend those.
She played Victoria a few years back on the top of a parking parkade, and it was lovely. I went to it.
Yeah.
So
and,
I want to
go
back. I'm just ready to go back to David Foster Wallace.
All right.
Yeah, I'm sorry we excluded you from the last 20 minutes of conversation.
No, I mean, I'm making notes.
I'm
making notes. This will go into my discovery list. And actually, I did, when I was preparing for this interview, and I did write down a couple of music questions, which were basically
was one of them about the Jens Lekman interview that Peyton did with Jens Lekman.
See, I've heard that name. I have listened to Jens Lekman before.
All right.
Yes.
I did not write that down specifically, but go ahead, Dave. Go ahead.
I read it this morning. I love him too.
Yeah. He's an interesting case because he's an artist from Sweden whose work is very much based on sampling, and often unauthorized sampling because he was like a 24-year-old in Sweden when he made these albums, right?
Yeah.
And so one album, Oh You're So Silent Jens, has been off streaming for like decades because of a sampling
and out of print
issue.
on vinyl too.
Yeah. And so it's a situation where like there are Jens Lekman albums that I've listened to like hundreds of times, and then Oh You're So Silent Jens is like, okay, I've listened to this on YouTube a couple times because it's just harder to track down, right? And so when I interviewed Jens, he said like, so for like he got a copyright. Finally, he was getting in legal trouble with Night Falls Over Cortadala, which is like an excellent foundational indie pop album.
Yeah.
And he decided, he's like, I just have to re-record them without the samples, which is gutting. But he was saying like he knew it had to happen when one of his oldest and like best known songs, Black Cab, he played it at a show, and then like a teenage fan came up and was like, I really like that new song you played, Black Cab, and it was like he was like, oh, that album is dead, we need to fix it. So sorry,
I was reading that interview this morning at the vaccine clinic because I got my booster this morning, my flu shot, and I laughed out loud a little bit to myself at that line. That was very funny.
That's great, yeah. Well, and maybe this can pull us back to Wallace because like Wallace, no, seriously, because Wallace was writing. He was still writing in like a very analog world, right? Like, and he was looking ahead and trying to envision what life might be like. There are scenes in Infinite Jest, passages in Infinite Jest where like he just describes Netflix and Zoom,
totally.
right?
Yeah.
And sort of anticipates the problems that are going to arise. And I think that like a lot of issues with sampling and copyright and just the way that music is produced now are fundamentally shaped by streaming and social media, and even the way that like songs are structured now. Like you see fewer bridges in pop songs because in order to be viral on TikTok they have to be short, right? Like sometimes a hit song can be nothing but
the
like
medium's the message.
Exactly. So and that's such a such an integral theme of Infinite Jest that like I find myself thinking about it all the time when I'm, you know, thinking about like the way that music is released, or the way that like a song will go viral off of like a single phrase that is popularized on TikTok, which is so different from what it used to be, and just the ways that like sample clearance becomes a whole legal headache, and even now like not even sampling, but like this is like, and this is me like waving my doomsday flag here, but like a couple of recent instances, like a song will, like someone will get a songwriter credit like based simply on vibes, or like
vibes.
No, truly, like
wow.
There was that court case involving Blurred Lines by Robin Thicke, which is a despicable song. I'm not here to defend that song, but
sure is,
they lost a court battle from Marvin Gaye's estate, who said that like they'd ripped off Marvin Gaye, and like I don't know, by like making kind of a Marvin Gaye type sound, which I, you know, like there weren't any samples or lyrics pulled from it. It felt like a Marvin Gaye vibe, and that was enough in a court in like the 2010s to hand a win to the Marvin Gaye estate. Or like Olivia Rodrigo, who's a very popular up and coming pop artist. Her song "Good for You" hit #1 on the Billboard charts, and people were saying, "Oh, this reminds me of Paramore's song "Misery Business." Like no similar, no identical melodies, no lyrical similarities, nothing. Paramore has a writing credit on that song now. Like after it's released, they were awarded a writing credit, which
oh my gosh,
is nuts to me. Like so
litigious.
So I think that's a real problem. Is that like I think we need. There's actually a very straightforward system in the music business for covering a song. If you just want to cover a song and not modify any part of it, like you can do that. You just have to hand a portion of the royalties to the original artist. Like if Taylor Swift wants to cover, like, I don't know, Kanye West, like, let's just put that out there. She can do it.
Seems unlikely at this point.
It seems unlikely, but she can do it, and she can give him money, right? And this isn't like Ryan Adams, who again is despicable. Like he did a full album that was just a cover of a Taylor Swift album, and he was able to do that. It just meant like Taylor Swift got like 90% of the royalties or whatever. Like there's just
is that how much? Wow.
I don't know. There's just a standard royalty rate that like you have to pay, and so any artist like Taylor Swift can cover a small artist and she pays them all the royalties. A small artist can cover Taylor Swift and pay her the royalties. That's just how it works. And I think we need a similar system for sampling.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But anyway, when David Foster Wallace was writing an Infinite Jest about like cartridges and the future of like streaming and advertising becoming less important, I think he was anticipating some of these issues, because
well, my music question for you was actually about what, or if you listen to music while you read or write.
Ooh, yeah. So I definitely, I have, the short answer is yes, and I have playlists that are sometimes just chill writing music. I have, for this current project that I have going, which is a contemporary interpretation of Little Women, I have a playlist of about 100 songs that just like remind me of the story that I'm telling. And I won't listen to that while I'm writing, because some of them are like high energy, like screamy rock songs, which is not conducive to writing. But you know, I'll go out for a walk when I'm stuck and listen to them and try to connect with the mood that I need to. And actually so this Little Women book, there's a scene, or there was a scene in the draft, and which I think will survive. We'll see. It's still being written, where one character takes a long Greyhound bus journey to visit another character, and is just like, when I finally meet this person in person, like, they're gonna fall in love with me, and we're gonna run off into the sunset together. And so I made I made the playlist that character would listen to on that Greyhound bus trip. And then I listened to that playlist while I took the Greyhound bus trip in real life.
Wow.
I could just fully like be in that character's head as they went from Boston to Pittsfield. I'm like, ooh, like we're an hour in, we're listening to Adele, like we cannot fail. Like it just put me in that character's head so completely. I went really method, yeah.
I'm so glad you asked that question, Matt, because that is such a much cooler answer than I was anticipating. I love that.
Yeah.
Well, and I love the idea of like a mood board that's like audio only, because obviously audio matters a lot to us. But you brought up the Little Women book, and I read your piece in Oprah Daily.
Yes.
Yeah, I read that as well today.
About sort of the gender or sexuality of Louisa May Alcott herself, which I knew very little about going into that article. So I basically, could you summarize that for us quickly, and how that maybe led directly to your next book?
Yeah,
and podcast.
And podcast, yeah. So I am I'm the host of a podcast called Joe's Boys, a Little Women podcast, where I read through Little Women chapter by chapter with a guest every week, and that's a lot of fun, and you should check it out. But my interest in this was piqued by the 2019 film by Greta Gerwig, and some subsequent writing about Alcott, in which one quote in particular was circulated, which went, Alcott had said, or like had written in a diary or a letter, like no one was really clear on the sourcing on this quote, which made me more curious. So Alcott said or wrote or whatever, I have often thought that I may be, by some freak of nature, a man's soul put into a woman's body, ... because I have been in love in my life with ever so many pretty girls and never once the least little bit with any man. So people were pointing to this one quote and saying, like, she might have been queer, who knows? And I dug into it, and the quote, like, it's a misquote, and it's been misattributed as like a journal entry or a private letter. It was actually a very public interview that she did, and it began with, as a child, I often thought that I was a horse before I was Louisa Alcott. I used to just enjoy playing like a horse and running through the fields with my nose in the air. Now, I am more than half persuaded that I am, by some freak of nature, a man's soul put into a woman's body. And that was the full answer. And then her interviewer said, oh, interesting, why do you think that? And she said, well, for one thing, because I've been in love in my life with ever so many pretty girls and never once the least little bit with any man. So that when I discovered the full quote, it was like, okay, interesting. Like, it wasn't just like, because there'd been some debate about whether to read that quote about, like, is she trans? Is she a lesbian? And in fuller context, it becomes clear, like, this is someone who identifies with manhood and also is attracted to women. Like, those things existed simultaneously. And so I've at this point, like, I've spent extensive time in the archives at Houghton Library at Harvard and at the Concord Free Public Library in Concord of Alcott and her family. I've read her letters and journals. I'm in the Louisa May Alcott Society as well as the David Foster Wallace Society, right? And
is there a lot of overlap between members, have you noticed?
Well, no, but I mean, we can get into the similarities between Little Women and Infinite Jest later if we want to.
That's fun.
But, what I have found is, like, from Alcott's childhood to her deathbed, she was incredibly clear about not feeling like a girl, thinking she should have been born a boy, thinking there'd been some mistake, wanting to be a man, actually shortening her name in private life from Louisa to Lou. Like, no one ever called her Louisa. She signs every letter Lou or LM Alcott, right? And the way that real sense of identification with manhood and disidentification with womanhood comes through in Little Women in the character of Jo, who is sort of her fictional avatar. Like, most people, if they know Alcott at all, they think, okay, she wrote Little Women. It's a book about girls. It's a book mostly read by girls. I guess she was a feminist. Like, that's where the understanding kind of begins and ends. And actually, like, I have had discussions with, like, TERFs, like, trans-exclusionary radical feminists, which is actually a term that I don't like to use because they're not feminists.
Yeah, I mean, totally.
Like, I've had people like that come into my space and, and make very, like, I know more than you statements about Alcott. And when it becomes, like, I try to be polite, like, I answer, I'm like, actually, you're mistaken, and this is what she actually said, this was the nature of her life. And they just stop talking, because, like, like, they can't win this. It's like, it's one of, like, sometimes there are unanswered questions about an author's sexuality. Like, I think Alcott is actually a good example, because we have that quote from near the end of her life where she says, I've been in love with ever so many pretty girls and never once the least little bit with any man. But she did actually have one romantic relationship with a young man, and which, like, appeared to be very sincere. And she never married. She talked about, like, not wanting to marry. She never had any kind of, like, close female companionship. Like, we don't have, like, Vita Sackville West and, like, Virginia Woolf letters from her or anything like that. There's some evidence of her, like, flirting with girls. There's also a lot of her saying, like, I don't like girls. When she was asked to write Little Women, she said, I never liked girls or knew many, but I guess, like... Right. So like, it seemed to fluctuate throughout her life, whether she was interested in women or men, or simply, like, not interested in romantic relationships at all. So that, like, I think the question of Alcott's sexual orientation is one that's quite, like, unanswered maybe in her own lifetime. Like, maybe she didn't even know. Or maybe it was very fluid for her. Whereas the question of Alcott's gender identity is not vague at all. Like, she was very clear. I long to be a man. I am by some freak of nature a man's soul in a woman's body. Like, those are pretty clear declarations. And in many ways, like, Alcott did, like, there were contemporaries of Alcott who did, like, transition and live as men. Like, Albert Cashier is one good example. Like, this is a person who was born female and then lived and died as a man. And that wasn't Alcott, but there were meaningful ways that, like, Alcott did what we might consider elements of transition, like going by Lou, not marrying, taking on, like, masculine roles in the family. Her father describes her at one point as my only son. Alcott, in, like, private correspondence and journals, describes herself as papa to her nephews, or, like, father. When her sister's husband died, she wrote, I must now be a father to these children. Like, so there's evidence that, like, she saw herself within her family. And I'm saying she, her, but, like, which sucks, but people get mad at me if I don't. Like, you know, like, she saw herself as, like, a son and a father. And in Little Women, which is what we might call autofiction, there's a scene where Jo is incredibly frustrated. She's like, I can't get over my disappointment in not being a boy. And one of her sisters strokes Jo's head and is like, you'll just have to be content with making your name boyish, Jo, and playing brother to us girls. So, like, there was an understanding of, like, social transition, if not medical transition, for the period. Yeah. So that's what piqued my interest in Alcott and Little Women. And this project that I'm writing is a contemporary adaptation of Little Women, in which some of the characters are trans. And I'm not doing anything radical here as much as just, like, excavating what's already in the text.
Right, yeah,
like,
that's cool.
If you pick up Little Women and just put your finger down, like, you will be probably shocked by just how forthright some of the, like, gender politics is. Like, it really leaps off the page. So, yeah, that's my work, and we can loop it back to DFW if you want to, because let's
stay with Alcott for a minute, because my mom was a huge fan of the Little Women books. Like, a lot of women in her, generations and going back were. And I remember the copy of the book that we had at home as a kid. Yeah. There was, like, a portrait of Louisa May Alcott, and and she always looked really sad to me. Like, she looked like a very sad character. But, like, you mentioned this in your piece, that, like, it's sort of ironic. She's become this sort of like ultimate woman. Like, she wrote Little Women, and, like, that's like her identity is wrapped up with this idea of like womanhood. And yet if you actually read, I think, all three of those books about, like, Jo's boys, it's much more, like, complicated than that. There are similarities with the school and, like, the boys. Like, I see that as an adult now. Like, you're writing a campus novel about a bunch of guys who go to the, in Massachusetts, nonetheless. Like, so I definitely see those similarities. But, like, was that a book that you picked up as a kid, or what was your introduction to Little Women?
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, Little Women was given to me as a very young child, just as a classic of children's literature, and especially of literature for girls. And I mean, in case it's not obvious, I am trans, so I did, like, come up as a girl, right? So Little Women was put in my hands, right?
I love that bio line in the book jacket where it's like, Peyton was the captain of the debate team at his all-girls high school.
It's like, yeah. It's yeah,
so good.
So I was, like, given Little Women in a way that, like, my brother wasn't, right? Even though when it was originally published, it was just, Little Women was just an across-the-board hit for children. And kind of the core cast of Little Women, the basic narrative is, like, it's based on Alcott's own life and growing up with her sisters. It pulls a lot from lived experience. But the one innovation is that a boy moves in next door and kind of becomes a part of the family. And Jo gets to have this friendship with this boy next door that allows her to kind of be more open in her gender identity. And the boy gets to be part of a world of women. So in that way, like, the main cast was it was co-ed, and initially it was read and loved by boys and girls, to the extent that Alcott wrote sequels that were called Little Men and Jo's Boys that were intended to appeal to all children, right? But it's interesting how, like, Little Women now it's the one people read. Like, Little Men and Jo's Boys are not anywhere near as popular. When the movie adaptations are made, like, Little Women is it, right? And it was also something like Alcott, it wasn't really where Alcott's heart was writing-wise. Like, the Alcotts grew up in really dire poverty. Alcott was working for a living from a very young age and writing for a living, mostly kind of, like, really tawdry, like, horror stories for the local paper.
That's awesome.
Which also dove into, like, themes of cross-dressing and, like, posing as another gender. Interesting. So, but when she was asked by an editor to write a book for children, for girls, actually, she said, I don't enjoy this sort of thing. I never liked girls or knew many, but whatever, like, I'll just write about me and my sisters. That was her plan. And it became a smash hit and took over her life and became, like, the thing for which she was known. It also made her incredibly wealthy and able to support the family for the first time. Her father was quite mentally ill and just wasn't able to be a breadwinner. Like, her mother was kind of the breadwinner of the family, actually. And so Alcott had come to a place where, like, now, like, had found this phenomenal wealth doing something that she really didn't like. And additionally, Alcott really wanted to enlist in the military. She wanted to be a soldier. Some of her most intense longing to be a man in, like, letters and correspondence and journals comes from this period where she wanted to enlist. And the compromise was that she enlisted as a nurse in a U.S. military hospital for black soldiers. And worked there for a few weeks before developing typhoid fever and becoming incredibly sick. And, you know, medicine being what it was back in the day, they treated that by dosing her with mercury. So,
sweet.
Wow.
So she recovered from the fever, but she had, like, lifelong mercury poisoning. And she died very young as a result, and she had chronic pain as a result. So, like, this was a disabled person who really was, like, working against incredible chronic pain to write these books that she hated. and feeling till the end of her life that, like, just she was a man's soul in a woman's body, and, like, just very uncomfortable with that. So what you said, Matt, about just, like, being able to read that sadness in her eyes is, I think, true to an extent. Like, and I don't want to, like, I also think she was a very funny person. I think she was someone who was surrounded by love. She loved to be active. She had very warm family relationships and friendships, especially with, like, young men in her life. But no, certainly, like, I don't think she got to live the life that she wanted to live. She didn't get to write the book that she wanted to write because so Little Women was published in 2 halves. And after the first half was published, people wrote to her saying, well, I want Jo to marry the boy next door. And she was horrified by that because, like, she had not ever envisioned that as a romantic dynamic. Like, it was very much for her like about like a kind of a freedom of gender expression for Joe, and she writes like angrily in letters and journals like, I'm not going to marry Joe to Laurie to please anyone. It's not happening. And like, and so Little Women ends in this, like, what she has said was like, she was trying to piss people off. She was like, I can't wait for all the angry letters. Like, so she had Joe married off to this like German professor who was twice her age and was just like about the most unsexy figure you can imagine. And the ending pisses everyone off. Like, no one... like, and it was like, it's been, people say like it was editorial pressure to marry people off, and that's true to an extent. Like, she does indicate that, but it was pressure from young girl readers who she really resented, who were like, I want Joe to marry Laurie, and Alcott was like, I want more for Joe. Like, that's not what, like, I am Joe, and that's not what I want. So it's a very interesting dynamic of just someone who was, I think, just a real genius, but never really got to express herself the way that she wanted to, which is sad.
Based on a lot of that, you know, what you've said, I think that it's exciting to think about what we're going to see from you next in your next book. I want to bring it back for a second to your current book, which is Both Sides Now. Joni Mitchell reference. Absolutely love Joni Mitchell and wish that she would put her music back on Spotify. She made her point, I feel like, with the Joe Rogan thing. But, you know, if it's okay with you, one thing we haven't done yet is ask you to read from it. And I would actually like to just read a bit. A place that I really like. Dave and I do this a lot, where we'll just read our favorite bits of it. And this is a really sad part. Like, the book has romance, it has humor, it has sadness, it has like the struggle to live your authentic life.
Yes.
And a lot of great comedy, clam jamming. I would just like to draw attention to that term.
That was great.
That sort of cock block.
But I feel like, you know, the poignant parts of it for me were, you know, was really important. There's a lot of big topics that are covered here in a really humane way. So this part that I wanted to bring up is, it's like midway through the book, and the main character Finch, he finds out that his mom has been laid off, and they are gonna have to cut back, and that includes like maybe not having health insurance. And so the mom reaches out and says, this is from page 118, I know Finch. Mom reaches out, squeezes my hand. It's going to be a hard few months, maybe longer. We're all going to have to sacrifice some. Everything I've just eaten threatens to come back up, but I need surgery. It's not something I can just sacrifice. Kid, listen. Dad sets down his own fork. This operation you want, we're talking thousands of dollars. You know we don't have it like that. But it's not, I'm not asking for it. I stammer, struggling for the right words. I need this, or else I'll go to college this fall and I still won't be able to go out when it's hot, or go run, or go swimming. And then Mom's hand in my own presses harder. I know, honey, she says, and I'm so sorry, but there's nothing we can do. You're just going to have to stick it out a little longer. Yeah, and like Rue says, that's the sibling. Mouthful, you don't really do that much running or swimming anyways. Because I can't. I bring my fist to my chest, my heart feeling the sleek, constricting fabric under my shirt, which is the binder. With this thing on, I'd be risking my life. Risking my life? Jesus, Dad snorts. He wipes his mouth, tosses the napkin down, stains blooming all over it, and then he turns to me and points a finger. Listen, you're not in danger. This house is in danger. Our mortgage, your tuition, that's in danger. My body is my house, I want to tell him. It's where I live. I haven't felt safe in it for a long, long time, and I'd give up anything, give up Georgetown even, to finally have a home of my own. Man.
Yeah.
That's a great passage.
Yeah. That right there, man. You know, I just love the way that you phrase that. It's really
thank you for
powerful.
Reading it. That's one of the more direct passages in the book, just about trans experience. And really, I don't know that people who aren't trans can really grasp how limiting some of these accommodations can be. like if you think about having to wear essentially a compression garment around your torso, I was going to say 24/7, but you actually can't. You can only safely wear it for about 6 or 7 hours at a time before it starts to be really painful. Like that creates all kinds of issues if you want to be someone who exercises, if you want to go out on a hot day. I've had experience where like I have been unsafe because I've been in an area where like it was too hot and I was wearing a binder, right? It's I got surgery, after Both Sides Now was published, and I had like the money to do it, and I hadn't even grasped, like, when I wrote that passage, like what an impact surgery would make on my own life. Like there are just so many things that I didn't even think about that had become second nature to me. So I'm glad that it connected with you as someone who doesn't have that experience, because Well,
and I think that's what you want from any good fictionist is for, to leap over that wall of yourself and to really live in someone else's shoes for a minute, in someone else's life. And I think, people who are trans who have read this and have had that same experience is probably more powerful for them. And, like you say, writing for yourself in some ways is one of the best audiences you can have. Because if you believe in it, I believe that, that it will find the other people who are either like you or not. I mean, really, what I think you're describing in some ways is a sort of a universal problem. It's very specific to a really, oppressed group right now. And people who honestly don't know much about it. Like me, I'm older. And, I was thinking when I was reading this book, like, I am probably closer to your parents' age than you, Peyton. And like when I was in high school, like I knew no one who was out. It was impossible. And of course, later on, as we grow up and like, over the past 10, 15 years, I see, there was actually quite a few gay people I went to school with. They just couldn't be out. And I think this thing is true with trans. And now that I have high school students of my own, and I see how much more, like, it feels like in some ways, like the kids are okay. Like, are you optimistic about, kids, or like, looking back on your own experience, going back, like, are things getting better in some ways? We've already said things are getting worse in some ways.
I think it honestly depends on what part of the country you live in a very serious way. Like, I think there are kids I don't worry about at all, and then there are kids who I really, I think about, there are some states that have actually banned gender-affirming care for trans teenagers. And like, there's a lot of fear-mongering about that, and a lot of misinformation. Like, people will say, like, like, we're not, like, children's hospitals are now, like, getting bomb threats because someone on Fox News said that they're mutilating the genitals of 4-year-olds, which I can tell you is not happening.
Of course.
Like, and I can tell, like, and this is, like you said, like, there was stuff that you maybe didn't know, Matt, reading the book, about trans people. Like, I wrote Both Sides Now for trans teenagers, and also in a very real sense for, like, their parents, or, like, anyone who just doesn't know much about trans experience. Like, I wanted it to be very accessible. And, like, one thing that I don't think many people realize is that any kind of gender-affirming surgery on a teenager is extremely rare, if not, like, there are certain procedures that are not performed at all. Like, top surgery is sort of the only one, and that's really only performed on people, like, over the age of 16. Like, it's top surgery just being a mastectomy. And, so mostly, like, what gender-affirming care means for teenagers, and, like, first of all, like, it doesn't really exist for children, like, for like, people who haven't reached puberty yet. But, like, gender-affirming care essentially just is, like, they're prescription drugs called puberty blockers, which will delay puberty. And the effects of these prescriptions are fully reversible. Like, you go off the puberty blocker, puberty begins. Like, it'll only affect you for the length of time that you're on it. And if you're like, you know what, actually I'm not trans, you stop taking the medication, and puberty just begins for you, right? That's like, so we are talking about a incredibly safe prescription drug that is prescribed very rarely for like that, and that is completely reversible. And like this has become the subject of so much fear mongering and misinformation. It just boggles the mind. So that's I mean that's what we're up against. And like there are kids in states who can't have that. And that it just it's bad.
And even in Texas, I do know some parents who are super accepting, and I guess I know it more from the parents' point of view than from the kids' point of view, right? Because like I say, when I was a kid, there was that was not an option. Yeah. But now, from a parent's point of view, a lot of parents are very clued into this very early, and it does seem to be better. Frankly, the younger they start, like that if kids are 18, it's much more of a difficult transition in some ways than kids that are socially transitioned at a younger age. I'm thinking of a couple of individual kids, and like it's very even weird to even like talk about it in a general way because they're so specific to these kids, and like each case, it just makes me feel like that is. No one like abortion. Like no one else should be involved in that decision except for these people. And like to talk about each one of those cases, it is very hard for me to even generalize. And I really just hate how much of a political issue Texas in particular has made of it, like because we have all these other real fucking problems that the government needs to be dealing with, and instead our governor in particular or lieutenant governor is just obsessed with like how can we terrorize these poor children, most of whom are not athletes and do not want anything but to be left the fuck alone, and yet they're just so targeted. And I think from a parent's point of view, that is a role that we can play to protect kids. And so,
I'm really glad to hear you saying that. Like, we need more people out here defending these kids. And I'll say also, like, trans youth are the focus because they're an easy target. It's very easy to play the think of the children game. Right. There's actually some liberal support on this because, like, you have feminists saying, oh my God, you're taking these young girls and saying they can't be tomboys, they have to be trans. Like, which is
no one's saying that. No one is saying that.
No one is saying that, first of all. But it's very easy to do a think of the children panic. And some of the rhetoric actually on the trans side of like, children will die because of this. It's like, okay, but also like, I know trans people who came out at like 50 and 60 and are very happy. Like there's no, like, it's not a race. Like, and obviously like the like basically puberty is irreversible. Like but there are, like, that's why medical transition exists for adults. Like it's possible to transition. And what I would say to kids in states where like puberty blockers have been outlawed, or like in Texas where I believe like parents of trans children can be prosecuted as child abusers. Like if leaving the state is not an option for you, like there are adults who transition as adults and are very, very happy. Like it's not a race, it's gonna be okay. is what I would tell these kids.
Absolutely. So I wanted to ask, basically, we've covered a lot of everything from fan fiction, a little bit of high school debate, Alcott, Wallace,
music, anything.
But I wanted to music, anything we didn't hit that you wanted to, kind of final thoughts that you wanted to add in. So for anyone who's listening.
So, I mean, I imagine, I know that Concavity Show began as The Great Concavity and was a Wallace-focused podcast. I know that many of your listeners are just Wallace devotees who may be like, Alcott, I don't know anything about that world. And so this is my pitch, okay?
Good ending.
If you are a fan of Infinite Jest and you're like, what's Little Women all about? Let me tell you, okay. Like Infinite Jest, Little Women is set in Massachusetts, right? During a period of North American civil strife, right? So I'm drawing the lines, I'm making the connections. Sisters instead of brothers, but still like family life and siblinghood is a prominent theme. A protagonist for whom virginity is a lifelong goal. A lexical prodigy in the protagonist. We have one like very sweet sick sibling, and we have one sibling who's slutty, and I mean that in like a fun, sex positive way for Amy March and like a derogatory way for Oren, to be clear. We have an absent father figure. We have a very present mother figure. All of these and more similarities between Infinite Jest. Also, I don't know if people realize, like, Little Women is a brick. Like, that is a very long book. Like, the two halves of Little Women, like, you're not going to get an edition that's, like, less than 500 pages. Like, it will keep you absorbed for a very long time. And famously unfilmable, even though several Little Women movies have been made. It is a real struggle for people to adapt just because of the structure and because the ending is so bad. Like, frankly. If you're unfamiliar with the most recent movie, like, Greta Gerwig, and I love this movie, like, we're approaching the ending, like, Jo is about to, like, run into the arms of her German professor, and we cut to a scene where, like, another Jo is, like, in an editor's office with the manuscript in front of her. She's like, I'm not doing it. I'm not marrying her off. Like, fuck you. And they have an argument, and basically, like, she negotiates for a higher fee, and it's like, fine, I will marry the protagonist off. And then, like, the swooning kiss happens, and then we just see Jo, like, watching her book get printed. So it's, like, very much, like...
It's transactional. It's, like, transactional. It's, like... and meta-aware. I mean, it's, like, postmodern in a way.
Totally.
Yeah. So
Greta.
I mean, that's my attempt to say, like, if you liked Infinite Jest, you may also like Little Women. It may be a very different book from the one you're expecting. So, yeah.
I think it's a good pitch.
Yeah,
I'm sold. I've never read Little Women, so
all right.
I'm adding it to my to-be-read list.
Wonderful.
And in fact, we had an author on last year, Steve Erickson, who recommended Bronte and Wuthering Heights, and like I think some people were surprised by that, but like a lot of these books that are like sold to us as classics, like for a good fucking reason, like you know what I mean, like Wuthering Heights still holds up, and it's like, you know what, I think Little Women is worth reading, and I think there are a lot of books that, you know, especially were not given to boys, you know, that should have been. Like Wuthering Heights is another one where, like, my mom loved it, and it's like, I'm not going to go watch a Jane Austen, Charlotte Bronte, and it's like, no, these are great fucking books, for a reason. And I mean, I'm lumping these in with like Brits, but like, I think it's just that the label of like a classic, you know, something from the 19th century. Maybe it's not the first thing people pick up. It's if we have to convince them, we'll, you know, go for it.
Yes.
It's like
that's my pitch. Like, adult men read Little Women.
All right, I love it. Peyton, that's great. Thank you so much for your time today. What is the best place people can pick up your book, Both Sides Know? What's the place where you get the most money from them buying it?
Oh gosh, I mean, I honestly don't know about that. I usually say wherever fine books are sold, which excludes Amazon. I don't like Amazon. Just buy it anywhere but Amazon. Ideally, at your, like, round the corner independent bookstore. But
local indie bookstore.
Yeah. If you don't have that, Barnes & Noble is fine.
Jim Gower on our show once said, please don't do the bad thing.
Yes.
By that, he meant buy it from Amazon.
So,
doing the bad thing.
Just... buy it anywhere you want, as long as you don't call me late for dinner, I guess.
Awesome. Where can people find you online, Peyton? What are some places people should check out? We'll link to all this stuff in our show notes.
So, well, like, there are fewer nowadays.
Twitter.
Twitter. Twitter, I think, is not long for this world.
Yeah, it feels that way, doesn't it?
I had, like, quit Twitter when like the Elon Musk deal was like announced, and then went back to it when he bailed, and then quit it again, and now it just looks like everyone is quitting and it's a gong show. So I'm not on social media anymore in any meaningful sense. But my website is peytonthomas.ca. I'm usually pretty speedy about getting my stuff up there, and you can listen to Joe's Boys, a Little Women podcast, which is updated bi-weekly.
Sweet. Bi-weekly. Wow, that's a rapid clip.
Oh, bi-weekly as in every 2 weeks.
What's our clip is like bi-monthly, like every 2 months.
Love that. Yeah.
So anyway, thanks again. We have a couple of housekeeping things Dave will do, and then we'll stick around for our Patreon subscribers.
Yeah. All right. Matt, where can people find us online, Matt?
We are Concavity Show. Sometimes on Twitter, depending on what's going on there. Like I say, it does seem like they could be bankrupt tomorrow. I don't know what the fuck is going on. And Instagram, we do post occasionally on Concavity Show there. And we love when people email us, which is concavityshow@gmail.com. And I think that's it, Dave.
Thanks to Parquet Courts, and thank you, Peyton.
All right, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Catch me now as I sing. Into darkness, I thought to be extinct.
And then if people have to subscribe to our Patreon to get the bonus part. So.
Wonderful. Okay.
Yeah. I love the line in your book. It's like, all I need is a Patreon and I'm set. I was like, yeah, I can ID with that a lot.
Yeah.